Do you guys remember that saga of Libreboot and GnuBoot videos I did a couple of months back? If you haven't seen the videos, I'll leave them linked in the description down below. As a quick recap though, Libreboot is a downstream project of Canoeboot. This is a project to replace your BIOS. Now, obviously, doing something like this, it's only going to work on certain pieces of hardware, mostly older pieces, but Libreboot previously was following a policy called the GNU Free Distribution Guidelines. This meant that no binary blobs could be included because, GNU, free software, all of that fun stuff. Leah stopped following this policy and instead swapped over to something called the Binary Blob Reduction Policy, where the goal is to get rid of all the binary blobs that are not necessary, that users don't need to be running. However, for the sake of making Libreboot more usable on a lot more hardware, blobs could be included in certain situations, things like CPU microcode, where there is no reason to not be running it. You either have proprietary software installed on your system, or proprietary software on your hardware that is broken because you refuse to update it. And will also include blobs in places where there just isn't a replacement that is free software. Now, when it was following the GNU policy, Libreboot was very popular with the FSF crowd. When it stopped doing that, there was a lot of bickering between Leah and those FSF people, most notably in this case, Neox and GNU 2, because they went and made a fork of Libreboot and initially tried to co-opt the name Libreboot. Now, Leah was fine with the fork. What wasn't fine is co-opting the project name. So after what I would call harassing them for quite a while, they eventually changed the name, and now it goes by GnuBoot. The problem with GnuBoot is it was based on a really old version of Libreboot, the last version before the policy change. So instead of forking the modern version and removing the blobs, what they had here was just really out-of-date software. Leah wasn't exactly a big fan of this being promoted as like a good thing to use, and decided to do a bit of trolling herself, and made her own project, which she originally called GnuBoot. Now, they weren't exactly very happy about this and sent her a cease and desist, so she renamed it to Non-Genuine Boot. This release was everything GnuBoot was supposed to be. It was based on a modern version of Libreboot, minus all of the binary blobs. Leah's idea here is that GnuBoot could just be deleted and they could use this instead. They weren't happy about that, there was a lot of bickering, go check out those videos. Now, while being similar, this is not the original Non-Genuine Boot website, because a bit more recently, Leah decided to do a bit more trolling. So, a couple of days ago, I was sent this image when it loads. This image. I didn't have any context for what this was. I could see it was based on Libreboot, so it's probably in some way related to Libreboot. But besides that, it just said soon. Like, what am I supposed to do with this? So it pretty much just sat there for a couple of days until I saw a bit more about what this was. Turns out this whole non-genuine boot thing wasn't just going to be a one-off release, because Leah since then has made 2 releases of what she is now calling Canoeboot, which is obviously a play on GnuBoot. And from my understanding, the plan is to just keep making releases until GnuBoot basically doesn't exist anymore. The idea is to outcompete GnuBoot until GnuBoot is just deleted from the face of the planet. Like with the prior non-genuine boot, the idea is to continue what Libreboot used to be in the past prior to the binary blob reduction policy, following the FSDG to a T, irregardless of how terrible that makes the user experience. This is not a project that you should be using. This project exists solely for the purpose of being incredibly petty to show that this can be done, but it shouldn't be done. Now, by not having just a couple of binary blobs here and there on the hardware that, you need to have it on, you end up having a fairly short list of supported hardware. This is everything that is known to work with the current version of Canoeboot. This is the short list of the already short list of hardware supported by Libreboot. when you're dealing with something at such a low level like a BIOS replacement, there's just not that many things it is going to work on without having actual support from the companies. And the plan is to keep it parallel with the Libreboot project. By the end of the year, there should be 5 more releases, so that's 10 releases total, 5 with the binary blob reduction policy, and 5 more with the GNU free distribution guidelines. As I said earlier, and I'm sure Leah would agree with me, Leah's entire goal here is to outcompete GnuBoot whilst being basically as petty as possible while doing so. So much so that there is a page on the website called Canoeboot versus GnuBoot. And this page really goes in depth over every single little difference and why Canoeboot is better. The main purpose of Canoeboot is to be technically superior to GnuBoot, while complying with all of its policies by providing ROM images and source tables adhering to the GNU free distribution guidelines, even though GNU FSDG is deeply flawed. I've talked about that plenty of times before. I really hate the guidelines. TLDR, as of 26th of October 2023, 7th of November 2023 as well, Canoeboot is about 1 year ahead of GnuBoot in terms of development and about 2 years ahead in terms of documentation. This current version of the page pertains to Canoeboot 2023-1026 versus GnuBoot 0.1 RC. You can find GnuBoot on the GNU Savannah website. Over on that website, absolutely nothing has changed. Leah gets so petty about this that she breaks it down commit by commit, showing exactly which commits have been made to GnuBoot that make it even slightly different. On this day, GnuBoot's current commit ID in the main branch is this right here, from 12th of October 2023. Most of the changes since 0.1 RC1 up to that commit are just documentation changes, and even still, only cherry-picking minor patches here and there that were already done in Libreboot, in some cases, years ago. It's worth noting that the GnuBoot documentation is based on Libreboot documentation from late 2021, or at most, very early 2022. I don't need to compare documentation, and it would take too long. Their documentation is 2 years out of date. What more is there to say? Along with this, pointing out the lack of some newer board support that doesn't need the additional changes made in Libreboot, board support that could be present in GnuBoot if it was based on a modern version. And here are easy dates to compare. Core boot default on GnuBoot 12th of October 2023, on GnuBoot 17th of November 2021. This one right here is the same. Grub, October 25th, 2021, compared to GnuBoot, October 3rd, 2023. CBIOS, 24th of August, 2023, compared to 24th September, 2021. UBoot exists here and doesn't exist here. Now, there is a slight compliment that GnuBoot does get. Note, GnuBoot does support downloading, deblobbing, and recompressing UBoot archives, and in fact does a better job of that than GnuBoot in some ways. But it does not yet actually build UBoot, and it does not support UBoot in any way on any actual mainboards. So it's like, a half compliment. But we did get a little bit. Don't worry though, there are no more compliments. Another thing Canoeboot does better is, because there has been a bunch of code audits since then and improving the general code structure, there are 9 shell scripts in Canoeboot versus 50 in GnuBoot, because GnuBoot uses the pre-audit design. Libreboot used to have lots of very simple scripts, but ended up with a lot of code repetition. And GnuBoot is based on a version that still had that code repetition. The new LBMK design generalizes all of the logic, doing away with the very hacky logic that existed in the old build system days. The interface in Canoeboot's build system is much easier to use. For example, the commands are shorter and easier to remember. GnuBoot doesn't even have a maintenance manual in their version. Their documentation exists in the same repository as the code, but their version of docs/maintain does not actually contain any instructions. Along with this, there's also the build system. Canoeboot's build system is smaller, which, lines of code doesn't really matter. But remember when I said, petty? Leah gets into every single little possible change that can be mentioned about why the newer build system is better than the older build system. If you want to read this, I'm not going to. I'll leave it in the description down below. I'm trying to drag this out. There we go. Just so I can scroll to the end. That's a lot of differences. But this page is not trying to tell you why you should use Canoeboot. Rather, it's just telling you that someone worse exists. Canoeboot is terrible, but GnuBoot is worse. Canoeboot and GnuBoot are both inherently flawed in their design. Both projects are inferior to the Libreboot project for all the reasons laid out in the binary blob reduction policy. The GnuBoot project is provided specifically to prove the merits of that policy by showing what Libreboot would have been by now if it continued adhering to the GNU policy instead of changing to its current binary blob reduction policy. Libreboot provides all of the same blob-free configurations as GnuBoot, when possible on any given mainboard, and that is the preference. But the FSF/GNU dogma states that the user must never run any proprietary software. This dogma is wrong. A more correct approach is to say that proprietary software is bad because it restricts the user's freedom to study and modify the software. It removes the power to say no when the developer wants to change the program in a bad way. It leaves them at the mercy of that developer. The point is this: free software is good, and we should be promoting it as much as possible. This means that a hardline, no-blob approach, like the policy implemented by Canoeboot, or GnuBoot for that matter, is entirely misguided, because it only alienates those who just want some free software. Most people like the idea of software freedom, but cannot go all the way yet. We should encourage people to make the right choices, but otherwise, just help them in whatever way we can, meeting people where they're at right now. The real summary here is don't use either, instead, install Libreboot. Now, if that was the end of the story, that would be funny enough. GnuBoot is basically dead, it's basically vaporware, but there is a little bit more to it. So, there is a website run by the FSF called my internet's not that slow, called the Free Software Directory, and there is a page on this website for a certain Libreboot fork, that being Canoeboot. Now, GnuBoot is also listed on another page, but it is kind of funny that a project whose entire existence is to basically just mock the FSF's policy and say why it's a terrible idea and nobody should ever follow it, is also listed on their website. And you know what? For those people who are like, super free software, don't you dare say FOSS, it is not FOSS, it is free software. It's a good thing that Canoeboot exists because, hey, they can actually go and use this and have a good experience, good relative to what you can have with not having any blobs, a good experience with Canoeboot as opposed to GnuBoot, which is always going to be out of date. So hopefully this is the final video I make on the saga. Hopefully. But there might be something that happens in the future, I don't know. At this stage though, this is probably the last time I'm talking about Libreboot, unless I decide to buy an old ThinkPad and start doing videos on it. No, I'm not confirming that, but it could happen in the future. So, let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Have thoughts? Let me know. Do you use Libreboot? Do you use Coreboot? Did you even know that GnuBoot existed? I would love to know. So, if you like the video, go like the video. And if you really like the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, subscribes, the Libreboot link in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and my face is real shiny because I refuse to turn an air conditioner on. I am dumb. I'm going to go fix that.
something like this.